Hello and welcome to the webinar. On behalf of the National Career Development Association, welcome to this session titled Maximizing Your Impact with Veterans. I'm Melissa Venable, NCDA Director of Professional Development, and I want to share just a few tips before we get started. During the webinar, please keep your microphone muted, and if you have questions, you can add those to the chat as we go. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the NCDA website and YouTube channel. And I will also email the link to everyone who registered. This program is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit, and for NCDA members, that will be added to your record after the session. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Emily King Grandinetta. Emily is a Master Certified Coach with a long history of working with clients on the transition from military service to civilian employment. She's also the author of At Ease, The Guide to a Smooth and Successful Military Transition. Emily, thank you for being here. I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for registering um, for this important topic, something I could talk about for days and have at times, but I won't today. I'll try to keep it short. And I notice I'm admitting people as they come in, so if that's helpful. Um, I'm curious if we have any military connected folks in the group dialing in today. Maybe you could go off mute so that I'm just trying to figure out a way that I could tell by um if there are, I want to thank you for your service and let you know that I really appreciate it. All right, so let's go ahead and get rolling. This is a big topic, one in which I will be going into great depth at the Atlanta conference during a PDI that I was invited to give with my friend and colleague Michael Pett, who is a disabled veteran. And so this is a bit of just kind of a dipping our toe in the water of this topic. I want to say starting out that um, I really think that the community of career development professionals, along with my community of certified, ICF certified coaches, are pivotal. We have a huge role to play in fixing a problem on this topic of military transition, and I'll share a little bit about that, where I think the opportunity is for us, and try to enroll you in my movement to change the world a little bit, at least the way that our country handles supporting veterans through that military transition and their families. So I'm going to go ahead and go through some slides. I'm Emily. As Beverly said, I am a Master Certified Coach through the ICF, behavioral scientist, and have done quite a bit of research, academic and otherwise, on this topic of military to civilian transition over the years. I wrote these books. At Ease came out in November of last year, so it's hot off the press, and just received word that we won an Indie Reader Award, Discovery Award, which is a pretty prestigious um, book for independent publishers, and field tested, has been around for a long time. I also moderate a social media community of over 8,000 members on LinkedIn, which you're welcome to join. And the purpose of that community, which I started about 12 years ago, was to bring veterans looking for civilian jobs together into a forum with employers looking to hire them. And now it's grown, and it's I'm sure much more diverse even than that. So it's free to join. You're free to post jobs there or find jobs there. And I welcome any and all. Oh, and my fun fact is I was rescued by a Morkie rescue. All right. So why we're here? We're here today um because the situation really can't continue the way that it has. And the way that it has is the way that military and most of our society defines military transition and supports military transition is as a resume writing exercise, and with the objective being to get a job, any job. And I really believe that that's contributing to a problem of underemployment that you may be aware of, but it's 3 times more um, common in veterans than non-veterans, which means they're finding and taking jobs that are not well suited to them or meeting their needs in, a lot of different ways. And this then creates job churn. So again, at the last number I saw, the average number of jobs that recently separated veterans have in their first year is 3. And that is not good for anyone. It's not good for employers who genuinely want to hire veterans but feel burned. It's not good for veterans who have that on their resume, and it's not good for their mental health and well-being. Underemployment has been linked with veteran suicide, which is, as I'll share with you, it's kind of staggering, staggeringly high. So this is my dad pictured here. He was in the Army, and that's kind of why we're here. So a little bit about that problem that I described. Veteran suicide is at 33.9%, according to the latest numbers, compared to 17.4 in non-veterans. And experts do cite transition issues as a primary cause. Transition stress, isolation, PTSD, and lack of access to mental health. These are factors. And underemployment is now even more and more often cited as a contributing factor. This first bullet point here, loss of purpose and identity, those are huge dynamics. They're part of the psychosocial aspect of military transition that I've studied for over 2 decades and actively worked in, trying to help support veterans and their employers work through. So when you put that idea of a psychosocial life event next to the idea of military transition as an exercise in writing your resume and getting a job, you can see the chasm that continues. Um, so I do believe that we collectively are part of the solution. We're, as career counselors, perfectly positioned to intervene at key points. And I recently did a program for a major business school who wanted to have all of its career counselors trained by me in so that they really fully understand the psychosocial component of military transition. And that's what I'll be doing in the PDI, and that's what we're starting today with this webinar. So I don't want to spend a ton of time here, but I do want to share with you a little bit about some of the background research and then, the truth about military transition, what it really is. And that's part of my brand is kind of, I'm a truth teller. And I'm trying to kind of demystify what goes on in that process. And then we'll talk about how we can help in our role as practitioners. So I started this a well, I was going to say undisclosed number of years ago, but it's disclosed right here on this slide. When I worked for a firm called Booz Allen Hamilton as an internal consultant, and I was summoned to solve a problem of, the defense market was hiring tons of retiring officers from the military, and they were failing. And it was my job as an OD consultant at the time to figure out why. And so, after a lot of study and analysis, um, I developed what I think is the first ever military transition program for an employer. To try to bridge that gap because, not surprising now, but at that time it was a surprise to everyone, even veterans who were working in the company, that leading in the military is really different than leading in a civilian environment. Who knew? So now we started to know, and that just, led to really effective solutioning based on just that information. So after doing that work, I was in the process of doing my master's thesis, and so I changed my topic to be, I wanted to validate what I found at Booz Allen with other defense contracting companies around the DC Beltway because they are huge employers of veterans of all ranks. And what I found was that the same challenges applied. It was not a Booz Allen thing. It was something to do with this change from being in the military to being a civilian. And these are just some of the areas that I looked at in terms of readiness and impact to business. Um, Usually when I hear as a consultant to organizations, when I hear from a company, it's for one of these reasons here. They're not seeing a quick enough return on their hiring investment of veterans, or they are seeing some negative behaviors and relationships. And interestingly, leadership is one of the biggest areas where um, veterans struggle as civilians. It doesn't seem counterintuitive to me, but 20 years ago it was very surprising because a lot of companies, that's why they hired veterans, right? Because they were leaders. Yeah, but they were command and control leaders in a very specific way, right? That didn't necessarily fit the corporate culture where employment is voluntary and people can just walk off the job. So a lot of basic things, assumptions that still persist today, which is why we're here. So this is my favorite slide. I think this is the money slide. In a survey of veterans that I conducted that asked about a lot of different business concepts and cultural characteristics, I asked them to assess their readiness for a job in the civilian world. Um, and on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being unprepared and 5 being fully prepared. And here's what we found. Those who took the survey while still in active duty, the average rating of readiness was 4.5 on a 5-point scale. But when we asked veterans who had been out 1 to 3 years to reflect back on their experience and rate their actual readiness, looking back, they rated a 1. So I don't know what you get from this, but what I took from this was, wow, like we don't know what they don't know, and they don't know what they don't know. We as employers, you know what I mean? And so, and there's a tremendous resistance, and I'll talk about that in a minute, to that, which makes it hard to help sometimes. I don't know what you've found, and I also want to let you know that you're welcome to type your questions into chat. I'll take them as we go, so don't worry about interrupting me. Um, I definitely want to hear your point of view and your questions and what you're finding. So this was kind of a big aha moment, and continues to be when people kind of see it in numbers. And in terms of the qualitative assessment of, responses, in all of the studies I've done, these 3 things are thematic, especially in the comments that are written or in the interviews, the examples that are given. They always tend to focus on either this loss of identity. Why? Because you're not wearing your uniform anymore. And not only are you not wearing your uniform, so nobody can see kind of how good you are, but no one else is wearing a uniform. And so you can't tell who they are relative to you. And it's just, it's that alone. And that's just a drop in the bucket on this topic of things that create disorientation when veterans first enter a civilian workplace. Loss of community, because in the military, you live where you work, right? Your families are there. It's a built-in community, and that isn't how it feels in a civilian environment after experiencing that. And then a loss of familiarity, all that is familiar around you, the language, the way places are set up, um, is totally new and unfamiliar. So these things combined, I think, are emblematic of what I'm calling the psychosocial aspect of military transition or impact of military transition. I think since a lot of you probably work for educational institutions, I think student veterans who go from military service into an academic setting, either undergraduate or graduate, I view that as kind of a softer landing. It's almost like a breathing space, it's a place to start to get accustomed to not being in uniform and other people not being in uniform. However, what I know from my research with student veterans is that once they leave full-time student status and go into a civilian workforce, they're confronted with a lot of the same things. So it maybe is delayed. It feels softer and it's just a delay. So in terms of, let me pause there and just invite you to engage if you'd like to. Okay. Silence is dissent in this case. So I'm going to just give you some of the high level findings that we use as we develop solutions for hiring organizations, as we develop solutions for veterans themselves. It's important to understand what, in my view, this is kind of my view, being king of the world, of what it is and what it isn't, military transition. So military transition is not a moment in time. For example, your last day of service or your first day of civilian employment. It's not a point in time. It's a process that transpires, and veterans will tell you it can last years and years and years. It can last through several different jobs and careers. So it's very much a personal psychological process. It's not about the administrative aspects of separating from service, like where to turn in your uniform, all the documents you have to sign, what to expect from the VA. Those things are important, but they really have nothing to do with this dynamic or the phenomenon of military transition. It's fundamentally, in my view and experience, a personal transformation that either happens or it doesn't happen, or it happens a little bit and then someone gets stuck. And and I'm going to share a tool with you in a minute that kind of helps to understand that. It's not successfully completed by writing a resume or a job. That is the current kind of understanding. You've transitioned once you've got your first job. And that could not be farther from the truth. It is successfully completed by working through what I discovered are stages in that transition process. So that's one of the tangible outcomes of my early research is a stage model. And I think that is the most powerful thing I can put into your hands to immediately not only deepen your own understanding of the experience, but to offer it and share it with the veterans that you interact with to normalize the experience for them. That's one of the powers of this. Everyone, I'm using a generalization, but veterans tend to really go through this process alone, feeling like they're alone and feeling like it's them and there's something wrong with them, that they have emotions that they don't usually have, like underconfidence, confusion, loss, sadness, all of that. And so the stage model really helps to ground them and stabilize kind of that. And it gives you a language for talking about where they're at. Military transition is not addressed sufficiently today by the military, even though they have what they call a military transition program. It's all of the things that are on the left-hand side of the slide. It is finally addressed by the solutions that I and my team have come up with, and it's not a shameless plug. This is the only thing out there that looks at this from a behavioral science, through a behavioral science lens. And I know that because I've been scanning the environment for decades now, and also because I'm hearing that from the market quite a bit. Um, all right, so that stage model I talked about, it's called the Military Transition Framework, and this is its kind of fulcrum. And what you can tell from this image is that it's a process that has a beginning and an end, or at least it moves in a particular direction. That's what the arrow tells you. It also has different stages or different sections, segments and that's differentiated by color. The other thing you'll notice is that those colors they don't have a discrete ending. So you don't have red, yellow, and green. You have red and orange and yellowish and greenish and green. You see what I mean? And that's something that is really important for everyone to understand that the military transition is not a task to accomplish, like, you know, like it's yeah, we have to accept this. It's the process and it goes on. So, there are three stages, and the first one is called detaching. And this is characterized by, in my experience, this is characterized by resistance. It's it can be kind of active resistance in terms of anger, judgment, criticism, resentment, or it can be passive in terms of uh, feeling overwhelmed. Um, it's the internal process that a veteran goes through or doesn't. With our help, they go through this, which is really looking internally at their feelings about separating from service, which can be huge. They might be excited or appear to be excited, and then on some level often are very excited to take off the uniform. However, they also might feel that immediate sense of loss and disorientation because of the lack of community and the loss of familiarity. And so often the way this shows up for me in my coaching practice and consulting is in the form of making everything wrong. Well, this isn't how we did it in the military. Back in the military, we did it this way. I don't understand. Who's in charge? Nobody's running the show here. Like a lot of noticing differences and immediately making them wrong. So those are cues for you to listen for that tell you that the person may be in this detaching stage. And if they're working through it effectively, usually with you, someone like you or someone like me to help guide them, they're able to work through those feelings and start to get used to the idea that things are going to be different. That doesn't mean they're wrong, etc. So that they become ready to learn. This is the downside of that resistance is regardless of how it shows up, it makes it hard to learn. You know how it is when you're feeling any kind of resistance, right? Our filters kind of close. Um, so that's the first stage. These are just some high level, very high level characteristics. It's an internal process that is either happening or not happening, or it's happening, but the person may not be aware of it. And to really move through this phase, they not only need to be aware of it, but they need to be working with themselves and hopefully with someone like us to help them move through that change. The focus is what is my identity outside of the military context? Who am I? What's my value? What's my mission? Because not only can nobody see, because I'm not wearing a uniform anymore, but nobody really seems to care or be that interested. The challenge of this phase is resistance to difference. And the importance of it is that it is an essential stage to move through so that you can be effective in the next stage. Any questions about this before I move on? Okay. This is how I hear it often. I didn't think it was going to be this different, or I didn't think it was going to be this hard. Or another way that I often hear this and can detect that someone is probably in the detaching stage is they're estimating the degree of change. Oh, this is nothing. It's just like another change of duty station. In the military, we change every 3 years. We moved to different countries. I did a different job. Okay, there's a concept that I kind of came up with called controlled ambiguity. And I think the military is masterful at controlling ambiguity. It's a way of controlling risk. So if you're on a base in the US and you're on a base in Iraq, things are set up the same. The uniforms are the same, the language is the same, the rules or the norms are the same, right? So they do a great job of minimizing ambiguity so that there's no disruption in operations. In the civilian world, it's like uncontrolled ambiguity, right? And so this is, part of what can be so overwhelming and disorienting in the detaching stage And what we can do, one of the things we can do is listen for, is a person, I mean, people are often shocked by how different it is. They're like, I didn't expect this, because the military doesn't prepare them. Because the military doesn't know they're in the military and they're not partnering enough with civilian behavioral scientists like us to help prepare veterans for this. So anyway, this is often how it sounds. The next stage is regrouping. Um, the this is
Emily,
Yeah.
there's a quick question in the
Oh
chat
yeah,
here.
yeah. What's the question?
Does the length of this stage change if veterans are hired to a similar defense company, but now in a civilian status, especially if there's still a mix of military and civilian personnels and cultures?
What a great question. That is a great question. That's another soft landing. However, there is still a lot to learn. Just that change in status from service member to civilian puts you in a completely different game. You can't be familiar with people, even though sometimes you know your clients. You served with them, you might have been in their command. Um, so there's still a lot of learning about how to be effective as a civilian working with an external client who happens to be military. You still have to learn the ways of the company that you're employed by. You have to learn the boundaries, and you also have to learn, as a veteran, you have to learn um, to unlearn a, how to interact with active duty folks. So, for example, one of the key things that I hear from companies, or managers of veterans is, they don't speak up. They wait to be invited in. I don't know what they're thinking. Well, there's a reason for that. In the military, there's a chain of command, and it's followed very specifically. Even in a meeting, you look around and see what people's uniforms look like to tell who's there, and you decide whether you have a speaking role or not. And when you bring that into a civilian environment, even if you're serving a military client, that is often viewed as being passive, disengaged, unassertive, um, uncollegial in some cases. So there's still a lot to learn, but it is a softer landing for sure. So the regrouping stage is often, well, the regrouping stage by definition is external, where detaching is internal. Regrouping is what happens as soon as a person gets a job. They're put into an environment that they have to somehow figure out. And so, whereas detaching is learning about self, regrouping is learning about the environment and the culture and the norms and all of that. And it involves unlearning, and regrouping is made immeasurably harder if the veteran has not worked through detaching, and many and most haven't, because they don't have people like us helping them. So when I say that we are the people who are going to change this, I really believe that. We're in a position to really make a difference. So regrouping is, it's also characterized by making a lot of mistakes, starting to feel like you're never going to get it right. So underconfidence or feeling frustrated. A lot of times those are things that I hear about from veterans. The focus of this stage is to learn as much as possible, as quickly as possible, while unlearning as quickly as possible. The challenge is being stuck in the detaching stage. And so the way that looks is the person is in this new environment, and they're resistant to everything about it. They're making it wrong. They're getting upset. They're looking for other jobs. I'm going to go with my buddy over here. He's got a better thing going on over there. And that's what leads to job hopping, because often what I've found is that all of the noise and stress and difficulty of this part of the transition often is attributed to the employer and the company. And so the veteran goes to another company, but things aren't really that much better. And so then they go to another one, and it's like, oh, wait a minute. Why did I leave the military? I should have just stayed in. And then again, if they have some support and some resources, they start to realize, ooh, there's some work I need to do. And they kind of start to go back and do some of that work in detaching, we hope. um, so that they can smoothly move through regrouping. So you can see detaching is necessary. An effective progress through the detaching stage is necessary for everything else to come, including well-being and satisfaction. So, okay, so the regrouping stage, the challenge is being stuck in detaching. The importance is that it's essential to succeeding over time in the civilian workforce. And in my view, it's essential to reducing needless suffering. So this is how it sounds to me when my phone rings and it's a HR person who says, we got a guy who's still in uniform. That's code for meaning this person hasn't, we've employed them, they've been here for maybe a little bit, and they're still acting like they're in the military. They're not adapting, they're not adjusting. Does that make sense? Okay. And a lot of times the regrouping learnings and the challenges there can be misinterpreted as performance issues, and they're not performance issues. In my experience and research, veterans do not leave civilian employers because of functional expertise, a lack of functional expertise, or lack of ability to execute task execution. It's all of the cultural mismatch and dissatisfaction or low performance in those areas. So you can see the importance of recognizing this stage. And sometimes, the veteran, this is where they get their first kind of splash of cold water. It's not when they get out. Maybe they easily get a job and they didn't have a problem and all that, but they get into regrouping and they're like, whoa. At some point, maybe it's their first performance review. At some point, they realize, okay, something is wrong here. One of the very first studies I did, I remember this will always stay with me. I was asked to coach because of all the work I did on that initial transition study. I became the person who was going to translate this for people and help people get back on the rails. And so I remember sitting across from a recently retired full bird colonel, very senior rank, who had just gotten his first annual review in which he completely failed to um, meet expectations on leadership. I mean, that was gutting, and there were tears. It was that was my first glimpse of the personal toll that this can take if it isn't handled right. The employers aren't prepared or set up really to fill in that gap either. You'd think that after all these years, my first book came out in 2011. And I've been out consulting and coaching and training and lecturing and all that ever since. And still, most employers put their veteran new hires through a regular orientation. They don't give it any thought to how their onboarding may need to be different.
Emily?
Anyway, yeah,
Yeah, there's a request if you would put the regrouping slide back up for a minute.
sure. And all of this is very deeply discussed in At Ease. So I'm giving you the broad strokes. But again, I do really believe this is a tool that can help you right away, help you to help your coachees or your students, whoever it is that you're working with, your clients. So finally, if things go well, the veteran reaches in the integrating stage slowly, and usually they don't even realize that they have. The way that they realize that they have achieved integrating is when they see a veteran new hire make mistakes that they remember having made themselves, and they're like, I remember myself doing that. I would never do that now. And integrating it's not dismissing or undervaluing the military experience or that military identity. It's adding to that and developing a fuller identity now as a civilian employee, a successful civilian employee, And it's characterized by just a feeling of flow that you know how you feel like you belong. Yes, you're still learning, but everyone is, right? And you feel like you're part of it rather than you're outside of it looking in, wanting to be part of it. Um, and this is another phase that should go on, as people say, well, what do I do now that I've like reached integration? Well, now you work inside your organization to make this process smoother for their new hires, because it's a way that you can help protect the organization's investment in hiring. Most companies are spending a lot of money attracting and hiring veterans, and then they don't protect their investment. They just, here you are, go figure it out, right? Very, very poor business decision. So that's what I always encourage people who have achieved integrating: mentor people, get involved in the employee resource group if the company has one. Be a success story and really help the company to churn out success stories, by having better processes. So here's the integrating stage. It's characterized by smooth operating. The focus is developing a full identity as a civilian employee with a military background. It's not either or, both and. The challenge is identifying when and where to leverage military experience in a non-military context, and how, probably. Um, so I've had a lot of veterans tell me that they learned early on not to reference their military experience because nobody really cared or understood, or it wasn't additive, which is hard to take. But if you can, you learn that and you reframe. You say, in my past experience, in a previous world, I did it this way, or you find some other way um, to do that is consumable by others. Because think about it, 90% of people don't have military experience and don't know a lot about it, not that interested. Um, so you don't want the veteran to just say, okay, I've just got to leave everything behind. Because what I found, this is interesting, what I found in leaders and employees at all levels is that once they get through that framework phase, those three phases I just went through with you, all of a sudden they just blossom, because now all of the leadership skills and all of the good skills and characteristics that they embodied and really lived in the military, all of a sudden now there's all kinds of room to demonstrate that, and they become hugely successful leaders. They can, and with devoted followers, and so when I'm working with veterans and they feel frustrated, or they feel they want to go faster, or they don't understand why they were hired at a level lower than they think they should have been, um, I really work with them to understand, that's a gift. If you're hired at a lower level, you don't want to be underemployed, but you don't want to do all of the learning of regrouping under spotlight because you were hired in as a senior leader, right? You're given runway. And in fact, I think when veterans are looking for jobs, part of what they want to be thinking about is looking for roles in which they can have some runway to learn, um, before they start trying to climb the ladder. Um,
Emily,
the
we've got a
import-
couple of questions in the
okay,
chat.
great. Yeah.
Have you noticed if there were any quicker transitions for military who had lived overseas and gone through a culture shock cycle prior to their separation versus those who remained stateside prior to separation?
I have to say no. And it's because of what I said before, that controlled ambiguity. Um, if you talk to veterans who've served overseas, they'll say the base was like a little piece of America. And there are a lot of service members who they do not integrate with the new culture. They don't want to know. They want to stay in the comfort of the base, wherever it may be. And they don't try the food. They just stay in their comfort zone. And maybe they become part of an expat community that also tries to not reach out too much. And so as a group, I'd have to say, in my experience, no, it doesn't make it any easier. I think what it does is it increases the likelihood that the veteran will expect it to be easier and therefore be more challenged by the actual reality they experience. It's a great question. Thank you. Other
And
question?
yeah, one more here. Can you speak to what employed veterans may experience during times of significant organizational turbulence and change? How might their response be heightened or vary from others? And this person's working with federal employees.
That's another great question. I mean, their first reaction is usually, especially if they're in detaching and regrouping, is this place is out of control. I don't know how this place stays in business. Nobody's running the show. Who's in charge? How can I get involved in fixing this obvious problem? So a lot of times they have feelings of superiority and frustration and kind of standing off to the side, observing the problem, admiring the problem, as the consultant would say, versus being part of a solution. Um, so part of what they need to learn, and this is part of what we share with them in our accelerated military transition program, which is for veterans and for companies. It's a turnkey onboarding solution. Is we really help them understand that change is the norm. They think in the military change is the norm, but it's controlled change, and it is actually required by market changes, global dynamics, everything, that a company might change its entire strategy every 3 years. You know, it might move in one direction and then have to quickly move in another direction because of customer sentiment. There's so many things that you and I kind of understand tacitly about the commercial world that are foreign to veterans. A veteran doesn't know what the value of an hour of his or her time is. Wouldn't even understand, like, would need to even really like understand that concept. And so many things like that are just not known. So I think in answer to the question, it can be viewed as chaotic and scary and unstable and ready, time to go. It can be viewed as, I think veterans who are moving well through the framework stages are able to see it as a familiar complex of moving parts. I mean, this is one thing that I think veterans bring to the workforce that they don't even really recognize, is their ability to create order out of chaos. And their ability to see a large, massively complex system and start to see where pieces can go, because they've been in a huge, massively complex system and they've been a part of making things happen, right? And so, if they can have that view of it, then I think they can really contribute to calming the environment, their sphere of influence in that company. If they don't react, but they see it as a puzzle that is changing because of a lot of dynamics. And I hope that answers the question. It's a big question, big answer. Any other questions, comments? Okay, so we have a little bit of time left. Sorry, did you say something? Okay, we have a little bit of time left, so I'm going to keep chugging. So this, as I said, this is kind of how it sounds when someone realizes they've kind of approached integrating. Um, so how can we help? My first answer to the question is we can really master this and share it and help people, not to pigeonhole people, but to help people know that it's normal to go through detaching and resistance and all that. And oh, by the way, it's really important that you move through that and not just stay stuck there. It's really important that you move through regrouping and not get stuck there. And that if you are struggling in any one of those stages, that's normal and we can help. So that's the first thing we can do to help. This is something that I came up with years ago, DRUMS. It's an acronym, and it stands for default reaction, use military style. This is very predictable. Uh, it's um, it's something that veterans are going to get feedback on whether they want it or not when they're in the civilian world. It's very hard for them to figure out how to change this because it is absolutely first nature. It affects communication style, interpersonal relationships. The S in drums is style. I think my head is probably in the way. So what we can do is we can help them modulate the noise level of their drums, start to recognize, start to notice, where if there's some kind of friction, maybe their drums are too loud. If they need to recognize that they are going to default, especially under stress, like we all do. I mean, emotional intelligence 101, we all tend to default when we're under stress. Our world gets very small. So if you think of a veteran who's transitioning as being in a constant state of some level of stress, it's likely their drums are not only loud, but they're contributing to the stress. So, so I think you know what I mean when I say military style. Very directive, very authoritative, maybe seems rigid. I just today, I think my newsletter talked a little bit about this. So, and I'm going to give you the QR code for that. It's free. It's on LinkedIn. So this is something that we can be aware of and help them to become aware of. Of course, and in coaching, the first step in anything is noticing. And then once you notice that, now you can start to have some choices and you're not just reacting. The other thing I want to leave you with is this notion of how careers can differ. And this is really important in the job search process, in the process of a veteran kind of figuring out how to talk about their previous experience in a way that's meaningful to a civilian employer. Um, and this is something that most civilian employers don't understand, which is that the image on the left I think of as a career trek. The image on the right is a career climb. In the military, it is perfectly acceptable and very common to advance while it looks like you're either staying the same, lateral, or even maybe going backwards. Whereas in the civilian environment, it's very clear kind of what upward looks like. So for example, let me give you an example. Someone who in the military led a command, a unit. So maybe they had 25 people in their unit. That's small. And they were in charge of every aspect of leading those people safely and effectively to execute their tasks and serve the mission and live to tell about it. And oh, by the way, someone who leads the command is also getting involved in if someone in their unit gets in trouble over the weekend with the police, they get involved. So I mean, there's a totally different view of personal boundaries. That's a whole other topic. But anyway, so someone who led a command could be promoted, and in their next role, they're not leading a command, but they're a special advisor to a very senior officer. Maybe they're sitting at the Pentagon. They've got no staff. So to a civilian, it's like, what happened? You lost your team. We value revenue and headcount. You lost your headcount. What happened? Is that a step back? No, actually. So like really helping the veteran understand how they could be misunderstood by a civilian recruiter. Now, seasoned civilian recruiters know all this, but and it's also important because a veteran um who is accustomed to progressing upward in the military, that's how it works. You're constantly moving up because the person above you moved up. They're building leaders, and brilliant at it. They come into a civilian environment, and if they don't see a clear path upward, they're not going to they're not going to necessarily, or maybe they don't want a clear path upward, but they see that there's an expectation of moving upward. My point here is many veterans quit their jobs because they don't know that the possibility of lateral mobility exists. And companies don't say that because they don't necessarily want people to jump into that. They want you to just stay in the role that you were hired for and do well there. But it's a retention thing. And it's also, so I think you can see the different ways that this concept is, it's simple, but it's important for all of us to understand and for veterans themselves to understand. So this was, I feel like I just kind of hit you with a fire hose, but this was just a drop in the bucket. And at the conference in Atlanta, the PDI is going to go into so many other areas we didn't even really talk about. And it's going to be interactive. I'm going to be co-leading it with my friend Michael Pett, who's a very accomplished civilian leader who is also a disabled veteran. So just wanted to let you know about that and leave you with this thought that, and this is not meant to be in any way diminishing of veterans, but the truth is that the veteran doesn't know what they don't know. Remember that first chart I showed you where they rate themselves a 4.5 on readiness, but seasoned veterans rate themselves a 1. So even if they think they do, and recognizing that they're already in a place of resistance, if they're in detaching, they're not going to be receptive to you telling them that they don't know. You know what I mean? So we have to be nuanced in the way that we address this. And these are some of the things you may hear that give you a hint as to where someone might be in that framework. Just wanted to give you a couple of breadcrumbs there. In the last 2 or 3 months, I started a newsletter. It's free. It's on LinkedIn. This is a QR code. It's called the Veteran Success Blueprint. And would love to see participation of career development professionals in that subscriber group. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing